On this edition of North Bay Bountiful, we explore the science and policy of groundwater. In Sonoma County, we'll examine 3 major groundwater basins that serve the needs of people and businesses. During the recent drought, groundwater became scarce as aquifers throughout Northern California began to dry up. New regulations will require municipalities and well owners to adhere to new guidelines for how much well water can be drawn. It's all coming up next on North Bay Bountiful.
North Bay Bountiful is made possible in part by Rocky, the free-range chicken, and Rosie, the original organic chicken. The Sonoma County Agricultural Preservation and Open Space District, Made Local Magazine, and Sonoma County Go Local. Support also provided by Pepperwood Preserve, and through the generous support of the Sonoma County Water Agency. Cultivate, celebrate, connect.
There is more fresh water stored underground in Northern California than is accessible from surface water sources, such as lakes, rivers, and streams. To understand just how essential groundwater is, we'll need to learn about how it is stored in the earth, how we bring it to the surface, and how it interacts with surface water. North Bay Bountiful explores the science of groundwater.
Most people get their water from one of 2 places. City water is usually taken from surface water resources, treated, and piped to your tap. But if you live in an unincorporated area, you might be getting your water from a smaller on-site well. This water is from underground aquifers, also called groundwater. So, what is groundwater? It's water that collects or flows beneath the Earth's surface, filling the porous spaces in soil, sediment, and rocks. When we say something is porous, that means it has small spaces or holes in it, through which liquid can move. Porosity is an indication of how much water a material can hold. When we say something is permeable, that means it allows liquids to pass through it. Permeability is an indication of how easily water can move through a material. Materials like gravel and sand are permeable and porous. Water flows through them easily, and they can hold a lot of it. Materials like clay and shale are porous and can hold water, but their pores are so small that water flows through them very slowly, giving them low permeability. With this in mind, let's talk about aquifers. An aquifer is a saturated area of sediment or rock that groundwater can move through. Groundwater stored in aquifers can be brought to the surface using wells.
So you can imagine if you think about something like the Grand Canyon and you can see all those different layers, well, some of those layers hold water better than other layers. And so they're all sandwiched together and interconnected in various different ways. And because it's all underground, it's hard to know about how exactly they're interconnected, but they're stacked on top of each other. So when you drill a hole in the ground, you drill through some geologic formations that aren't holding any water, and then you can drill down into one that is.
We use wells, groundwater wells, for all kinds of purposes. So the typical shallow wells here in this vicinity would be down at about maybe 200 feet deep from the ground surface, but they're pumping water from 60 or 70 feet, and they're pumping it from a water table or unconfined aquifer largely.
So a confined aquifer, if you go back to imagining the stacks of different rock types, if you think of it like a sandwich, like if it's a BLT and it's a slanted BLT, then if the tomatoes are the water holding geographic feature, then the water flows down through the tomatoes. But if the bread is impermeable to water, the bread is then confining the aquifer in the tomatoes. And so because it's on a slope, water keeps pushing in, and so there's pressure on the water from the top of the hill to the bottom of the hill. And then the cool thing about a confined aquifer is if you drill down through the bread into the tomatoes, you can get water to come up under pressure. And an unconfined aquifer is just one where it has it has contact with the surface, and so there's nothing holding it in place.
Water that collects underground is held in an upper unsaturated zone and a lower saturated zone. The unsaturated zone is located directly beneath the land surface, and the pore spaces hold both air and water. In the saturated zone, all the open spaces are filled with water. The water table is the very top of the saturated zone and the bottom of the unsaturated zone.
Well, the saturated zone would be all of that soil, or whatever the lithology is at depth, that's below that surface water level, or we call it the free water surface, that you would intersect when you drilled the hole, say, and you dropped a float in, and you'd see this water standing, or like standing water. So it's all of the soils or lithology below that free water surface is considered saturated. There's a zone above that called the capillary fringe, or has some other names, or seepage face, that's also saturated but held there by capillarity. So like a capillary tube sucks water, like a straw, a thin straw, out of a beaker. The capillary fringe holds water in the saturated, it saturates the soil there, or nearly saturates it. Above it, the soil begins to desaturate, associated with the capillary pressures in the water, in the soil water, until when you come near the surface, it's relatively dry if we're away from, wet areas.
Water table is just sort of the common word that people use to refer to aquifers, but it's a little bit confusing because it sort of implies that there's some sort of table underneath there, and it's just this giant lake underground. And because of the way rock formations are formed and interlayered, it's not really the way things are. And so while basically when people say water table, they're talking about the depth that you have to drill down to hit water.
What does it mean to recharge the water table?
You can think recharge the groundwater table is basically put water into that aquifer. It's like, imagine if you had a glass full of sand, and you could pour water into that glass, even though it's full of sand, because there's all the little holes in between the sand bits. And so you could pour water in there, and then if you drill the hole in the bottom, water would just leak out the bottom. And so the more you pour water in the top, the more you're recharging the ground table, or filling up that aquifer.
I'm interested in that recharge area, or that zone, that we sometimes refer to as the vadose zone. So vadose just meaning the unsaturated or partially saturated zone. And looking at agricultural recharge in particular, for example, irrigation of orchards or regular row crops or alfalfa, hay crops, and seeing what fraction of that, leaches the root zone or moves through the root zone and, is beyond the crop demand and goes down to the deeper groundwater.
How do surface water and groundwater interact? Some rivers and streams gain flow from groundwater, and others lose flow to groundwater.
The streams flow across the surface over some permeable layers and some impermeable layers. And so and also the streams themselves carry a lot of gravel and sand. And so they lay down a bed of permeable sediments. And so water can flow down through that gravel and sand into the groundwater if it's an unconfined aquifer. But if it's a confined aquifer and there's a clay layer, like that piece of bread on the sandwich that the water can't get through, then it doesn't flow down into the groundwater. And then also you can have losing and gaining reaches. And so some reaches of a stream are leaking water into the groundwater, and the groundwater is pushing up into the stream.
How does this all relate to our own Santa Rosa Plain and Laguna wetlands?
Wetlands are kind of complicated because you would think it's a giant puddle of water on the surface. Wouldn't that be a great way to recharge the groundwater table? But the fact that it's a giant puddle on the surface suggests that there's no connection to the groundwater, because if it was connected to the groundwater, it would all drain and then it wouldn't be a wetland. And so wetlands themselves are not great groundwater recharge features, but they do create sort of a dam and back water up above them. So water flows across the Santa Rosa Plain and then hits this feature, the laguna, and that does trap water that people can then use as groundwater.
Whether your water comes from city pipes or from a well, groundwater is a resource we all share. It is our responsibility to manage groundwater sustainably so that future generations will have access to safe, clean water.
The 3 groundwater basins of Sonoma County cover over 175,000 acres and feed over 8,000 wells. The Sustainable Groundwater Management Act gives local agencies, counties, and water districts the power to sustainably manage groundwater resources in order to maintain water table levels and ensure that water will be available in the future.
California enacted a comprehensive plan to manage water supply called the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. The legislation was passed in the wake of a 4-year statewide drought.
The main drivers for the development of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act really came from the Central Valley and some of the Central Coast areas where there was significant overdraft of groundwater basins and land subsidence and other problems that have been occurring over years.
The recent drought exacerbated the strain on groundwater supplies.
During a drought, what we typically see is because surface water and groundwater are interconnected, you will have less recharge into the groundwater basins through streams or lakes. But also, you'll see more groundwater being pumped to meet the needs and demands, whether it's for agriculture or other purposes.
The depletion of groundwater levels can put water systems in jeopardy.
Groundwater is an important resource throughout the state. It can represent up to 50% of water supply for cities and agriculture. In some cases, it can represent the majority of the water supply. It's an important resource statewide, and it's also an important resource for us here in Sonoma County to make sure it's managed sustainably and is available for future use.
Locally, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, is expected to bolster the Sonoma County Water Agency's ongoing efforts to manage surface and groundwater supplies.
The state has identified 14 groundwater basins in Sonoma County. 3 of those basins are medium priority according to the state. So our mandate, our mission locally here is to implement SGMA in those 3 basins only. And those basins are the Petaluma Valley, the Sonoma Valley, and the Santa Rosa Plain.
SGMA mandates that local GSAs, groundwater sustainability agencies, manage each basin.
Groundwater is something that's highly variable region to region, and so the state recognized that local agencies are best suited to manage that resource.
GSAs were created in the 3 Sonoma County medium priority basins in compliance with SGMA's June 2017 deadline.
The next step is those agencies are required to prepare and submit to the California State Department of Water Resources groundwater sustainability plans that lay out how those agencies are going to demonstrate that groundwater is being sustainably managed in their basins.
The plans, which are due in 2022, will show steps to sustainably manage groundwater within 20 years.
There will be a lot of debate and stakeholder input and a lot of discussion on how we get there, but it will be locally derived.
One of the bigger steps is going to be the setting of measurable thresholds and the identification of sustainability levels for the basin. And that is going to be a process that will involve advisory committees of each of the groundwater sustainability agencies. There'll be a number of public workshops to gather input and perspectives from the public that can be integrated into the plan.
The advisory committees are made up of a diverse cross-section of groundwater users, including rural well owners, environmental interests, and business owners.
As a rural well owner, I wanted to know what was going on, and I threw my name in the hat to be on the advisory committee. I've been really pleased with the process. It's been extremely transparent. Every person gets to speak their mind, explain their point of view, and have others consider it.
The sustainability plans really need to identify how you're going to manage your basin without causing problems. Lowering of groundwater levels, reduction of the amount of storage of groundwater in your basin, depletions of surface water due to groundwater pumping, degradation of water quality, seawater intrusion, and land surface subsidence.
If local agencies are not able to meet sustainability deadlines, the state has the authority to intervene.
In my opinion, we're controlling our own destiny, so we can do nothing and let the state come in and run a groundwater sustainability program. The fees will be more. They won't have a feel for the local community, what's important to people. This is really a group effort to make sure that we do control our own destiny.
A fee study is being carried out to determine how to finance groundwater sustainability plan development. The GSAs are continuing to look for state grants to offset any local fees.
At this stage, we have a lot of resources here in this county that can potentially help us get to sustainability without having to require curtailments of people's pumping.
Potential strategies that could help the area meet its sustainability targets include increased recycled water use for irrigation, as well as the development of groundwater recharge and conservation projects.
If you focus on the common goal, which is a healthy environment, a healthy economy, and healthy community to live in, then who can't agree with that? Finding that place where everyone can say, I got to speak my mind, there were some compromises, and I'm happy with what we ended up with. That's the goal.
Hopefully, SGMA will increase everybody's awareness of the overall water picture, specifically groundwater conditions, because we can't readily see groundwater. We can see reservoirs, we can see streams, so we get a more obvious visualization of what the conditions are for surface water. Through implementation of SGMA, folks will be a lot more aware in general of their groundwater conditions and its vulnerabilities, and some of the things they may be doing or implementing in the future will actually help their groundwater conditions. Even though they can't directly see it, they'll have that general awareness.
In other parts of the country, drought may not be a problem, but groundwater resources have become contaminated with agricultural chemical runoff. Many communities are struggling to find solutions to the threat of contamination. Harvest Public Media reports on efforts in the Midwest to contain and manage chemicals in the groundwater.
This is Nebraska, where the Platte River drives east through ranch country and sandy soils to the western edge of the Corn Belt. But most of the water here is not on the surface. It's deep underground. Nebraska sits atop the deepest part of the largest supply of fresh water in the nation, the High Plains Aquifer. The Platte River flows from Denver over the heart of the aquifer and actually helps replenish the groundwater that becomes a main source for drinking and irrigated agriculture. In fact, Nebraska has more farm acres under irrigation than any other state in the country. It's one of the top states in corn production. Over the years, farmers have applied phosphorus and nitrogen fertilizer to their fields in force. So much, in fact, that it's contaminating parts of the aquifer they depend on, making the water unsafe to drink. One city in Nebraska is seeing that firsthand and working with farmers to keep the problem from getting any worse. Planting is underway for Bill McLeod on his farm in central Nebraska. He's been raising corn and soybeans here his whole life. Back when he started, McLeod says farmers thought differently about the best way to use nitrogen fertilizer to make their crops grow.
Everybody kind of understood that a little was good, a lot might be better.
You could always put on more, but in the soil, nitrogen fertilizer turns into nitrates that can leach into the groundwater. And in high doses, nitrates are dangerous for health, especially for young children and pregnant women. Unfortunately, decades of old farming habits have left a troubling legacy. In this area, the subsoil is loaded with nitrates from fertilizer, and there's no place for them to go but down, into the aquifer. Here's what's happening. Farmers put nitrogen fertilizer on their fields. In the soil, bacteria convert it into nitrates that are taken up by roots to feed plant growth. But when there are too many nitrates, water from rain or irrigation carries the extra nutrients past the point where roots can reach, and eventually to the aquifer below. The aquifer is moving like a slow river. When the nitrates fall into the groundwater, they move too, and they build up. Here in the High Plains Aquifer and others, there are pockets of nitrates pushing far past the legal limit of 10 parts per million. In central Nebraska, a pocket of high nitrate water is flowing right toward the wells where the city of Hastings draws its drinking water. It's a looming problem for the city's residents and for Marty Stengy, the environmental supervisor for Hastings' utility system.
5 times the drinking water standard. So those are some really areas of high concern for us.
Stengy and his team are building a unique line of defense.
Basically, we're going to catch the nitrates coming into the municipal wells.
They'll use strategically placed wells like this one to act almost like a filter for the aquifer, skimming off nitrates as they move toward the city. Stengy knows that nitrates tend to collect on the top of the aquifer, so unlike most wells, this one pumps from the top, middle, and bottom all at once. So the top water, the highest nitrates, it'll go off and be treated.
And then that clean water that's retrieved from that treatment process then will be mixed with this bottom water.
And go back underground.
And it'll go back underground. But you have to pump them all at the same time to make it work.
Clean water will be pumped back down into the aquifer, so the high nitrates never reach the wells that supply Hastings residents. High nitrate water left over from the cleanup will be sent to a storage lagoon and used to irrigate and fertilize this field. Nitrates that would be harmful to humans can be safely absorbed by this alfalfa.
So as the plants are growing, they will consume up those nitrates. So we're going to take lemons and make lemonade.
Stengy says Hastings will spend $46 million to complete the system, a lot for a city of just 25,000 people. If the water is going to be safe long-term, farmers will have to make lasting changes. Farmer Bill McLeod already uses fertilizer differently today compared to when he started.
Nowadays, liquid fertilizer that is not that cheap, and so we're trying to watch our pennies and just use what we need to out here.
Farmers are motivated by more than money. McLeod and others are being asked to do more, even if it's not by choice. Groundwater districts around Hastings have put additional rules in place to manage fertilizer use. McLeod says farmers have mixed feelings toward the rules.
We are doing it, because we care and everything, and that we're required to do it, too. And it's for future generations, it's just not us. My grandkids are going to be in this area, so they've got to live with the stuff that we're doing out here today. So that doesn't bother me quite so bad then to comply with some of these rules when you think about the future, I guess.
McLeod says farmers don't like the extra paperwork or restrictions on how they farm, but he says they do want clean water for their neighbors, their crops, and for their own homes.
Currently, 80% of California's water usage goes to agricultural production. In the state's Imperial Valley, One farmer is finding ways to save water by using new methods of targeted drip irrigation. For farmers who use groundwater as an irrigation source, drip irrigation holds great promise to protect this valuable resource.
Jack Cato manages a 660-acre farm here in the Imperial Valley. Passing through the rows of alfalfa one morning, he spots water pooling at the edge of a field. An underground hose has sprung a leak.
Sometimes the trucks will run over the tapes and damage them. Let's see, there it is.
Believe it or not, this leak is actually a sign of water efficiency. That's because it's a leak in a water-saving drip irrigation system. Subterranean hoses deliver water right to the roots of Cato's alfalfa. He says switching to drip brought his water use down, way down.
Almost half the water usage. Not quite, but almost.
Even when it leaks, this drip system still conserves much more water than the alternative, flood irrigation, which basically drenches the farm.
That big canal you saw over here, it's got gates. You open the gate up and it goes into another smaller ditch.
Open the floodgates bordering each field and water gushes out to saturate the soil. A lot of water can get lost below the roots and through runoff, but most alfalfa farmers out here still rely on flood irrigation, and Cato understands why.
When you've had a successful method of farming and then you come along and you got another method and it's not 100% proven, then why take the gamble?
Alfalfa is grown as feed for animals, mainly dairy cows. No crop in the state uses more water than alfalfa, making it a regular target of criticism in drought-stricken California.
Whatever farmer starts doing this, he needs to take baby steps and learn how to take care of this. It's not something you learn overnight or in a book. You have to study your fields daily.
Cato still uses flood irrigation on some parts of his farm. Those fields use a lot more water, but at least with them, he never has to worry about finding a leak.
Change is difficult, but new challenges demand new solutions. As California struggles to deal with the effects of drought and climate change, it is more important now than ever before for all of us to get involved in the policy discussions that will govern our future use of groundwater.